Hello everybody, welcome back into my shop. It's Wednesday, it's time for another Renaissance Woodworker Live. Bummer about that SpaceX launch, huh? I was really looking forward to that all week and the thing got scrubbed. That's not why we're going a little bit later today, although that was a happy coincidence. I had a workman in the house because my dryer went up on me, so I had to schedule around that whole thing. But it was nice because I was all set up, had my NASA TV up, ready to watch, first manned space flight from U.S. soil since 2011, and wah, electrical activity. That was no fun. All right, but we're not here to talk about SpaceX and the future of manned space flight and all the fun things that we science fiction readers love to talk about. It's Renaissance Woodworker Live. It's kind of an open Q&A. I've got a series of questions that were submitted from patrons. So see that little thing down at the bottom there. If you want to support the show, by all means, patreon.com/Renaissance Woodworker. I've had quite a few people who've sponsored the show recently, and a few of them have submitted questions ahead of time. So I want to get to those. We're going to talk a little bit about auger bits and why they stopped cutting. Talk a little bit about some sawtooth geometry. And then I've got a question from Instagram about adjusting a plane that has neither a Stanley Bailey adjuster nor a Norris adjuster. A lot of the Wood River low angle jack planes have just this fixed adjuster. This is not a Wood River, this is a Tay-Tool plane, but it's the same type of deal. There's no lateral adjuster on it. So it gets to be a little bit more difficult. I'm just adding a coat of Renaissance wax to it because I haven't done it on this particular plane yet this season. So this is kind of my every 6 months rust prevention ritual, if you will. Yeah, ritual is a good word for it. But I just put a little Renaissance wax on and it gives me that kind of more nuclear option for taking care of rust issues. Certainly the humidity's been climbing a bit lately around here, so it's something that I've got to think about. So typical story for today. If you have questions, by all means, put them in the chat room. If you can put them in all caps, it makes my life so much easier to be able to see them. And other than that, let's get started here. So first things first, Jeffrey had a question about skip teeth on a saw. He's got, I believe it's an 11 points per inch crosscut saw that he was wondering why not do a skip tooth. So a skip tooth design is exactly as it sounds. Take like every other tooth or every fifth tooth or sixth tooth, or it can vary, but you're filing that tooth off completely flat. So what you're doing is increasing the size of the gullet every 4 teeth, 5 teeth, 6 teeth, however many skip tooth you want to go with. The original skip tooth would be every other tooth is filed flat, so you've got these big giant gullets between them. A six skip tooth is every 6 tooth is going to have that tooth gone and open up the gullets. You see this a lot in bandsaw blades. You will also find it in scroll saw and fret saw blades. I have some skip tooth blades in my fret saws, and this one is actually a true skip tooth where every other tooth is skipped, and I don't know if we're ever going to be able to get it to focus well on this, but what I've got here is a blade. No, we're not going to get it good enough, but you can see closely there, every other tooth is gone. So I've got these big wide gullets, but it's not really a gullet, it's just a flat. It's just an empty space between the blade. This is actually the blade, this is an 11 points per inch fret saw blade. It's what I use in my fret saw that I have at my dovetail bench for all of my dovetail waste removal. This guy, this new concept saw. It's got that skip tooth design in there. And that's fantastic because most of the time when I'm using that fret saw to remove waste between pins and tails, I'm dealing with thicker stock. Fret saw, fret work in general, you've got some pretty thin material that you're working on. 1/4 inch, maybe 3/8 of an inch thick. think of your typical scroll saw work. So you don't really have that much wood that the blade is going through. Also, especially on a hand perspective, I use a bird's mouth fixture and I'm sawing vertically with it. If you've ever seen any of my videos, this fly swatter video that I did a while ago, I did all the fretwork on this at my bird's mouth fixture standing right here. So I'm presenting the saw at 90 degrees to the work, so there's even less saw blade engaged at one time. You know, if you present it at 45-degree angle, there's more saw blade running through the wood. I'm at 90 degrees, it's the minimum amount of saw blade. So through thin stock, it's not really that important. But as I go into dovetail work, where I'm doing 1/2-inch drawer sides or 3/4 or 7/8 inch or 1-inch thick carcass sides, that's a lot of material. And removing that tooth, skipping that tooth, just gives me more room for sawdust excavation. It's not really meant to be a fast job. You know, using a lower pitch saw like that is going to be a little bit slower than, you know, coming at it with an 8 points per inch saw, but you get better dust management. So it doesn't really speed the cut up, but it does prevent it from getting gummy and just stopping cutting. There's just more space for the dust to roll into. So Jeffrey's question is, could I do that to my 11 points per inch, 26-inch crosscut saw? And Jeffrey, I say don't. I don't really see the point of that. First of all, the skip tooth idea works great in bandsaw blades and scroll saw blades, powered saws. Because you've got higher RPM on your bandsaw, the time in between, you know, from one tooth skip to the next tooth, that time is really, really short. On a handsaw, when you're working at a much slower speed, moreover, you're reciprocating your action rather than continuously spinning around. You're going to find that that little skip stutters and it creates a lot more vibration and it creates kind of an unpleasant sawing experience. On a powered scroll saw, where it is reciprocal, it's moving a heck of a lot faster than I'm moving with my fret saw on a much, much lower basis. It's a minor issue, but really what you're talking about is if you remove a tooth, if you create a skip tooth in this, the idea is to what? Excavate sawdust better? It's certainly not going to speed things up. So why would you want to do that in the first place? What is your goal that you're trying to do? I don't really know. I mean, if you have an 11 points per inch, 26-inch saw, yeah, that's a little fine, but essentially it's acting like a panel saw. And just because a panel saw is defined by, 24 inches or shorter, doesn't mean that you can't have a panel saw that's 26 inches long. In fact, the other name for panel saws are toolbox saws. And the Stanley Company and Diston started calling things toolbox saws because it was designed, it was shorter so that it could fit in a toolbox. And you look at even today, most toolboxes won't handle a 26-inch saw, but a 22, 24-inch saw will fit in there nicely. So that panel saw became ubiquitous with a 22-inch or 24-inch long saw. It also became finer pitch because it was used for working with a little bit more finished material, already plain material or relatively thin material. The way I see it, if you have a 26-inch panel saw that is set with a finer tooth, all you're going to get is a more efficient, quicker cut because you've got longer saw and more teeth to engage with that 11 points per inch. That actually can be a particular boon. All you're losing is the ability to stick that panel saw in a toolbox. And if that's not what you care about, then I say keep it. I think that's actually quite an advantageous saw to have around. I have my rip and my crosscut panel saws, but if you remember from my saw nest video about a month ago, I actually have some finer pitched crosscut and rip full-size hand saws specifically because I find myself working in thinner stock or I find myself working with a lot of S4S material that I want that thinner tooth. I'm going to get that lower third out of the way. So I would say there's not a thing wrong with that 11 points per inch crosscut saw. I think it's perfectly fine. It's not something you want to be doing a lot of rough cross-cutting work in 4/4 or 8/4 stock. It's going to be quite slow. Even if you create that skip tooth pattern, I doubt that it's going to excavate the sawdust properly. Now, one thing you can do to help better sawdust excavation is create what's called sloping gullets. So when you file a saw, you're filing directly across the saw plate. So your file is 90 degrees to the tooth line, and it's creating a gullet that is 90 degrees to the tooth line. Well, you can actually take your saw file and angle it slightly so that your gullets are not quite 90 degrees, but they're sloping off one side or the other. And what that does is open the gullet up a little bit, and it leaves a little bit more room for sawdust to kind of squeeze up around the sides. Not a lot, but just enough that can open that up a little bit. Now, this is not something that I would really recommend a lot on a saw you're doing a lot of hardwood work in. But if you are doing a lot of softwood work where that sawdust can be particularly gummy, or if you happen to be working in teak a lot where the sawdust is really quite gummy and it clumps up on you because it's so oily, that can actually be beneficial. But once you commit to sloping gullets, you're kind of there. Like the only way, you can't file out sloping gullets without removing the teeth entirely and starting over. And it will take up a substantial amount of real estate on your saw plate. So committing to sloping gullets is kind of a life decision here, you know? It's not easy to go back from, not without sacrificing a lot of steel. So I don't know. It's something that I feel like I should mention because people will ask, what about sloping gullets? But I'm not really a fan of it. I don't think it adds that much more sawdust excavation. And in my mind, if you're having a real problem excavating the sawdust, the solution is always going to be a coarser pitched saw. And yeah, that's nice to say because saws are expensive. Even on the vintage market, you've got to go out and get another saw. But you know, I think once you have a saw that's set at a certain pitch, unless you're ready to file away the teeth and completely retooth it, there's only so much jiggering you can do with it to really change what it was meant to do. And in this case, an 11 points per inch crosscut saw, it's meant to be used like a panel saw, meant to be used on already surface material, thinner boards, actual panels for projects. So, moving on, I wanted to talk a little bit about auger bits because I get this question a lot, a whole lot. The auger bit is not a tool that requires a lot of effort. It shouldn't anyway. But what I see is a lot of people really muscling their way through an auger, trying to bore a hole while like really leaning into the thing. First of all, the number one thing I say in order to keep your hole, wow, Freudian slip, to keep your hole plumb is by resting your forehead right here on the pad. This allows you to essentially sight down it, and it kind of gives you a better feel for gravity. You know, perfectly plumb, the gravity's pulling straight down. If I'm off one side or the other, I can very easily feel how I'm rocking, especially as I'm turning this. You know, if I'm leaning one way or another, you're going to very much feel that lean as you rotate it around. But even if you don't do these, even if you're standing upright, and honestly, this is where I've got this set right now, this is a bit high. I usually would like to have things down a little bit lower just because you get a little bit better, it's easier to stand with your head if you've got a little bit more leverage on it. But getting that's why I do a lot of boring down on my saw bench. But what should happen, and I'm actually going to zoom in on this because I think you're going to get a better shot of it. Okay, maybe not. Little technical difficulties. What is going on? The camera does not want to respond. I can address a couple questions while I'm troubleshooting this. How are my Scott Meek planes dealing with the humidity swing? I've never had a problem with Scott's planes giving me, you know, particular finicky issues. My shop is not climate controlled. I do have an AC unit in the corner. There we go. Sorry about that, guys. Just had a little hardware interface. The AC unit gets turned on when I'm in the shop, when I need to be doing some work in here. So it's not like it stays on and stays climate controlled all the time. But there's really not that much in the way of movement going on with my planes. Scott has done a pretty good job of using stable woods. And I should be very clear and say, I have one smoothing plane from Scott, but all the other planes I have from Scott are joiners or jacks, and they're meant to take a heavier shaving. So if there's a slight adjustment in the sole, it's not really noticeable because I'm taking a heavier shaving and I don't really need it to be that flat. In the case of my smoothing plane, when you add the Macassar ebony on the bottom, it really helps to stabilize things. It's almost like plywood in some respects, where you've thrown up a cross banding here, and the sucker is just dead flat. I've never really had any issues with it whatsoever. Plus, the way this is laminated, I've got ingrain here, ingrain here, ingrain here, ingrain there. There's a lot of area for the wood to off-gas, if you will, to equilibrate. So easy answer there, I have had zero problems with them, from my 36-inch joiner down to my smoothing plane. All right, let's switch cameras here. So the way the auger bit cuts is it is done entirely, all the work is done with the lead screw. That lead screw pulls the cutting lips through at a controlled rate. The points per inch controls that. So as I am boring, and I've already got this hole started, as I'm boring, I've got zero pressure down on this bit. The spurs will engage next, and you see that they have scribed the perimeter of the hole here. So now I've got a line scribed in, and what that's doing is severing those fibers so that now the actual cutting lips can come in and essentially just lever out, scoop out the material that's left behind it. So with very little effort, or I should say very little pressure down, this sharp auger bit will bore a hole. Now it does not matter how fast I rotate it, how much I push down, it's going to advance at the same rate. That rate is driven by the threads per inch on the lead screw. Now I'm going to bore all the way through here. Normally what I would do, I feel the point come through on the other end, I would flip the board over and I would bore from that side in order to give me a cleaner exit hole. I'm not really concerned about that in this particular rough sawn piece of poplar, so I'm just going to go all the way through. But you can see, granted, this is only a 1/2 inch bit, so it's a relatively small bit, but it does not take really any pressure down. The lead screw is doing all the work. So what I hear from a lot of people is that they're cutting along, and it just stops cutting. It almost starts to spin in the hole. The cutting lips just aren't doing a thing. Did the threads get strepped out or what? And there's a couple things that go on. First of all, if you're doing a lot of rocking from side to side, as you are rotating this and you're going one side to the other, all you're doing is essentially reaming out the hole that the lead screw is running in. So that hole ends up becoming bigger than the lead screw itself, and the lead screw starts to slip. Once the lead screw slips, yeah, there's no more advancing going on. It's the same reason that when I get to near the other side of the hole and that lead screw starts to poke out, connecting through that last little bit does require a little pressure down because there's no lead screw pulling the cutting lips through anymore, which is also why you tend to get really dramatic blowouts on the other side, because you have to push the cutting lips to engage them a little bit. Now I've specifically grabbed a beater auger bit here that has not been sharpened. I have no idea how this is going to cut. I suspect not very well. So the lead screw engages, and it's cutting a little. Now granted, we're a thin bit here. All right, but now it's just spinning. It's not really doing anything. So if I zoom in on this again, and you can tell I got some shavings. I'll sweep those out of the way. But now I'm not getting really any shavings. I'm getting a little bit of dust. And if I push down on this, maybe I can get some shavings as I'm engaging it, but it's really quite small. And I can feel just the resistance, rather, as I'm rotating this. It feels like it's just spinning in the hole. That's because it is. And I can look in there and see, yeah, I'm not advanced any more than maybe 1/4 inch. Now, if I look at this, I can see, first of all, there's practically no cutting spurs on this. So the Cutting spurs make the cutting lips job easier. Those spurs are slicing around it. Same way when you're cutting a dado across the grain, you want to knife in both sides of that dado so that you can scoop out the wood in between. If you don't knife in both sides of the dado, what happens? You get massive tear out because you're cutting across the grain. Well, if I don't have those spurs severing the fibers around it, the cutting lips have to work harder. And the cutting lips are working in direct opposition to the lead screw. The lead screw is pulling the bit into the wood. The cutting lips are trying to wedge the bit back out. They're fighting against it. So the harder those cutting lips have to work, the more force that's in direct opposition to the lead screw. So, couple things. The spurs aren't outlining and severing the fibers, or B, the cutting lips themselves are not sharp. If they're not sharp, it's requiring more force to lift up a chip. Again, more force against the lead screw. And what happens is the lead screw just strips. You know, you look at, especially this 1/4 inch bit, I mean, the threads on this are tiny, tiny, tiny. It won't take much to strip it, especially in a softer wood like poplar, something like pine, or I would even go the opposite extreme in a harder wood. It's going to strip relatively easily with very little opposition force, just because the threads themselves don't hold on to them really well. Now you'll find some auger bits have coarser threads than others. Some of the really, really old ones, the threads have just worn down. You can actually sharpen those threads. One of the best things you can do is bore just a little ways, just engage the lead screw a little bit, and then back it out. Take some honing compound, like the green chromium oxide stuff I use on my strop, and rub it into the hole. And then you can just run that lead screw back and forth through there and essentially sharpen your lead screw by the hole that you just created. It's the same principle that I use for sharpening or honing my molding plane. Well, I'll use a block of wood to create the molding profile, in this case an ovalo. I'll rub the little chromium oxide crayon on there, and now I have a strop that's perfect for my 1/2 inch ovalo. It's the same thing you're doing here with those lead screws. You can sharpen that lead screw. And if you need something more aggressive, you can put other sharpening media in there. They have diamond paste and things like that that can really help. The larger threads, you can actually get in there with a needle file and kind of touch them up. But I think what you'll find more often than not is just cleaning it up, removing the gunk and getting any rust out of that lead screw can help more than anything to open up the threads. Then do that little sharpening technique with some compound, and that will help. But even perfectly sharp, and this is a fantastic condition bit. This was actually sharpened by Ernie Stevenson over at grandpa'slittle.farm.com, which, by the way, if you're looking for auger bits, the #1 source around. Don't bother with the new stuff. I have some Gramercy auger bits. Don't even bother. Go to grandpa'slittle.farm.com and buy them from him. They're so much better, like night and day better than the new stuff on the market. The point is, the lead screw doesn't really have that much force. It can't really hold its own very well against the cutting lips or the spurs. So if they get even the slightest bit dull, all hell breaks loose. If you get into a harder wood, like if you're boring 3/4 inch dog holes through a hard maple top, you've got to have really, really sharp cutting lips to do that, or that spur or that lead screw is just going to strip and be pulled out. That may mean you may have to resharpen your cutting lips like every 3rd or 4th dog hole that you drill, just depending on how much you're doing. The other thing you have to think about is there's a hell of a lot of heat generated while you're cutting. Again, more heat, the harder the wood. So we're back to that hard maple bench top. You can generate a lot of heat and actually dull that bit pretty quickly. So the question that came in, if I remember correctly, is from Peter, was I drill a hole and then it seems to be dull. Well, that may be the case. I don't know what wood you're boring in, but you may be generating so much heat, and the steel might be kind of old, maybe it's a little bit softer, that actually you may be dulling it from one hole to the next, depending upon the magnitude of the hole, size of the bit, the speed with which you're trying to do it, because there's the other thing. You can bore, if you have the stamina and the strength, you can bore straight through a 4-inch hard maple bench top, or you can slow it down a little bit, back it out, give the bit some time to cool off, and then go back at it. You got to have some patience to do that, but you do have to recognize if you're boring straight through, you're generating a lot of heat, and that heat can actually prematurely dull your bit. When it stops cutting like that, 99% of the time, it's because something has become dull. And dull is a spectrum, right? You know, there's dull as in it won't cut hard maple, and then there's dull and it won't cut cedar. Those are two very different kinds of dull. You're going to need different kinds of sharp to handle hard maple and different kinds of sharp to handle red cedar, right? So you have to look at why is it stopping cutting in this particular situation? And the answer is generally, I need to go back and sharpen those cutting lips. The spurs really don't need to be sharpened all that much. And as I said, the lead screw, maybe once, you know, in the lifetime that you own the tools, you actually have to sharpen those threads. You have to make sure that they don't get chipped and stripped, but really are you sharpening it? Think about it. You're not sharpening the threads on a wood screw, right? It's just, that's not what it's about. The inclined plane doesn't rely upon sharpness. It relies upon the inclined plane to do its job. So, if you know how to sharpen it, that's how you fix it. The other thing, as I said, could be if you find yourself constantly having this problem, you may need to check your boring style. If you are really, you know, if it's hard work and you're really cranking this thing around, look at the shank of your bit. And if you are rocking a whole lot from one side to the other, right there, I've already stripped the hole. In fact, I can just pull it straight out because it's widening and reaming out that hole. You need to establish a boring technique that really is as straight or as still as possible. And that requires you to really move with very little rock. And this again is where anchoring your forehead on the pad can help hold things straight up and down. But where things start to get difficult is when the resistance kicks up. Again, think of that 4-inch hard maple bench top. This gets harder, so you're like really, you know, pushing and pulling, and that, you know, that will cause some rock in and of itself. So trying to keep a little bit of momentum going so that you can move in a more constant rotation will help control that, and it will cut very, very cleanly. If you are unable to do that with maybe the size of the hole that you're trying to make, you got to use physics. And you need a larger swing brace. Most of us have these typical 12-inch or 6-inch, you know, depending on how you do it. This is a 12-inch swing. No, sorry, this is the 10-inch, isn't it? Yeah, this is the 10-inch. The 10-inch is very common. 12 inches is a little less common, but 12 inches is really, if you're doing a lot of 3/4-inch holes in a hard maple bench top, 12 inches is really where you want to go. This ash bench top, I've drilled a bunch of holes on this with the 3/4-inch bit. It works. It is harder work, no doubt. It would be easier with a 12-inch swing. With that 12-inch swing, I've got more mechanical advantage, so there's less rocking back and forth as I'm boring, less reaming out the hole, which is also why I have this brace. This is a 6-inch swing, so 3 inches and 5 inches. This guy I use for most of my 3/8-inch bits and under, especially my 1/4-inch augers, or I will even use some brad point bits in this. If I'm doing any smaller holes, it's very little effort, so I don't really need a lot of mechanical advantage in the swing. That tighter swing allows me to keep that bit really, really straight, and that can help a lot. The greater the offset you have on that brace, obviously, the more the tendency will be to rock back and forth. And you have to be very careful that you're not stripping out that hole when that happens. But I'd venture to say that your problem is generally the dullness of the bit, and whatever you've done that may be dulling it faster than another. If you really are finding that this sucker dulls like halfway through a hole, you may just have some bad steel. Who knows what that steel's been through? Who knows if the temper's been drawn out of that steel because of that heat buildup in just day-to-day boring, or if anybody, you know, tried to grind the thing and they pulled out all the temper in the process of grinding it. It's hard to say. That's the risk you take with vintage tools, is you don't know what was done with it beforehand. Let's look at the chat room a little bit here. Thanks everybody for coming out. Looks like a lot of you are drinking. Hopefully you're not woodworking and drinking. I say that, and I'm actually wearing Birkenstocks, so don't listen to me on safety tips, folks. Don't drink and woodwork, and yeah, wear shoes that have closed toes, but I'm not planning on doing a whole lot here. Jeremy says, I'm building a workbench. I'm building a workbench without one. I was like, without one what? Okay, building a workbench, and you don't have a workbench. It's the chicken and the egg thing. How do you build a workbench when you don't have a workbench? Nothing but 2 sawhorses and rough cut lumber. Any tips on planing with Lee Nielsen number 8 and scrub plane to face joint 3-inch thick by 6.5 foot long red oak? Do it on the floor. If you have sawhorses, certainly you could take a piece of plywood and lay plywood across it, and you could use a planing stop of some sort, even just nail a planing stop onto that plywood. But, it's a little bit awkward because it's down on the floor, but set some plywood down on the floor and just work against a stop that's attached to that plywood, or, if you want, again, set up on the sawhorses. The problem with the sawhorses is they may have a tendency to rock. So you need to weight those sawhorses down, some sandbags, a small child sitting on the sawhorse to keep it from sliding around on you. But because you're talking about, what did you say, 6.5 feet long? It's not a particularly long board, so you could take a regular piece of plywood, even get a sheet of, it doesn't matter, it can be the crappiest plywood out there because it doesn't really need to be flat. Get a sheet of plywood and maybe rip it into quarters. So you've got 8 foot by 12 inch wide, typical plywood is 4 by 8. Rip it into quarters, laminate all 4 of those together to get kind of a thicker top. What's 3/4 times 4? 3 inches? 3 inches? Yeah, something like that. So you get this 3-inch thick top, which will prevent sagging a fair bit. You could run that between your sawhorses, clamp it down to the sawhorses, screw it to the sawhorses for all I care. A lot of sawhorses have a section to put like a sacrificial board on the top so you don't saw on your sawhorses. If that's the case, screw into that so you've now attached it to your sawhorses, and then put some weight, however you want to come up with weight. As I said, there's all kinds of heavy things floating around the house that you can stick on there to help weigh things down. And now you've got a temporary bench. This bench I built without a workbench. I did have a series of sawhorses that I built most of it on, and it was just a matter of clamping things to those. The one thing I will tell you is don't get precious over a perfectly flat face when you're jointing and laminating those things together. You're talking about a 6.5 foot long board. There's a lot of room for error, and there's a lot of room for clamping out gaps in that board. So that would be the other tip I would say is don't focus on dead NASA tolerance flatness on those boards. It's okay if they don't perfectly mate together. That's what clamping is for, and a lot of glue. Because you've got so much glue surface on 3-4 inch thick top over 6.5 feet long, that's a lot of glue surface. And the other thing I will say, and actually Christopher Schwartz talks about this in his Workbench book, actually shoot to put a slight hollow in the middle. So you think you've got it jointed, come back with your scrub plane and run it right down the middle of the board. So you've got a little divot in the middle that relieves some material in the middle and allows the edges to come up tighter. This is not about creating this perfectly flat face to mate together. I've seen a lot of people use 2x4s for their benches and literally just glue them together with no planing whatsoever. Those rounded edges mean some planing on the face, but you really don't have to have precision flatness when you're building a bench. So that would be my number one tip, is just relax a little and don't try to get that dead flat, which means less planing, which means less having to gerrymander a solution for planing. But I've done a fair amount of planing on the floor. The workbench that I built at my in-laws' place in Maine, the other thing you can do is just skip the planing altogether. I did a Nicholson style bench, then I didn't end up laminating everything together. I relied upon the cup of the board and a carriage bolt right in the middle to flatten out that cup, and I was good to go. It's a totally different style of bench though. Where would you start with green woodworking? Spoons. Spoons. Simple, easy. There's all kinds of specialty tools. You can buy spoon carving knives, or you can use a gouge. A draw knife would be a really good idea. An axe would be kind of nice, but again, I've known people who've used a bandsaw to cut out the outer shape and a gouge to carve the bowl. In a perfect world, if you have like nothing, you can get a spoon carving knife and a sloyd knife, and you pretty much can get really far. A camp axe will allow you to do a lot of roughing work, and you could even skip the draw knife. But the beauty of spoons is you don't need any really specialized holding or any of that type of stuff. You can, cut a blank down very, very close to size, very small. You can sit, hold it in your lap, and do the carving you need to do. And the wood that you want can come from a branch in your backyard. It doesn't have to be big, huge blanks, so you don't have to worry about splitting logs into smaller blanks. We've all seen it on YouTube where guys have this log and they rive out that perfect blank. It's not really necessary. Cut off a bit of branch and carve from there. You're dealing with green material. A Sloyd knife could pretty much get you like all the way there minus the bowl. Do I have a... Oh no, I took that in the house. I'm going to say I had a spoon in progress, and I think it's in the house right now. Everything is done except the little bowl part, and all I have to do is come back and hollow it out with a spoon knife. There are lots of spoon knives on the market. Knives, I said that again. Inexpensive ones and expensive ones, but even the expensive ones really aren't that expensive. But again, a gouge will get you there. You don't have to necessarily have the specialized spoon knife. If you are thinking of taking a longer journey into green woodworking, you may eventually get a spoon knife. The thing is, if you want to go into other directions with green woodworking, the spoon knife really, it's got its use in making spoons. That's why we call it a spoon knife. Not a whole lot of usage beyond that. So that is one thing to keep in mind. If spoons don't really hold your attention, maybe buying a specialized spoon knife may not be a good idea. But I think you'll find they're quite enjoyable just because you can carve a spoon in an evening, again, with a bit of branch that you took out of your backyard, and it's really, really fun. It's incredibly meditative. It's also very communal. Not now, people, with COVID, but it's a great opportunity to get together with some friends, sit around a campfire, and carve out spoons. That's why they always have spoon meetups. So I would definitely start from there. The principles you'll learn in that can be translated to bowls. The ideas of working with green wood and getting a feel for how green wood works can very easily translate onto a pole lathe or moving into chair work even. It's just a very low barrier to entry place to start. Jeffrey, I know you've got that Atkins saw on the way. Don't get rid of that 11 points per inch saw, man. I know that you can sell a saw in order to use it to buy another saw, but I think you're going to find a lot of use for that thing. Don't get rid of it. How good of a job can something like a number 5 do for flattening something like a cutting board? It works just fine. It's a pain in the ass. Listen to one of the recent Wood Talk episodes about cutting boards, or even go to my Renaissance Woodworker blog and you'll see I did a post in there about building a cutting board by hand. If it's an ingrain cutting board, it is hard work, but you can do it. A number 5 would actually be the perfect tool for that. Even though it's called a block plane, don't use a block plane to flatten a cutting board, unless it's a really small cutting board. Works just fine. Sharp blade, good planing technique, works just fine. Jeremy, you saw my recommendation on auger bits. grandpa'slittlefarm.com. Don't go anywhere else. Seriously, there's no reason to go anywhere else. How important is a ratchet on a brace drill? Never used. No, that's not true. I've used it once. Not important. I don't think it's important at all. Of course, the minute I say that is the minute somebody's going to go, oh, now I need it. And if that's the case, fine. But there's also a lot of these braces. Both of these braces have a ratchet on them. The more modern braces all have ratchets. I've got a Spofford brace and another kind of 18th century brace that don't have ratchet mechanisms. Very rarely do I ever need it. So yeah, I wouldn't worry about it. Is a compass plane essential or nice to have when working curves? It's a nice to have. It is a sheer luxury. The compass plane, the thing you have to remember with a compass plane is it's nice. Look at the dock chair that I built a couple summers ago. It's not too far back on my page. I used the compass plane in that to create the long sweeping arcs. But you have to remember, it's not about going from one end of the curve to the other. It takes you halfway to the curve. And then as you go uphill, the grain goes against you. So you have to turn around and go the opposite way back down. So while you may think, oh, it's great to give you that nice fair curve, you're not really planing through the entire arc. You're planing through half of the arc and turning around and going the other way. So with that in mind, you can do the same thing with a draw knife, do the same thing with a spoke shave, you can do the same thing with a rasp. The compass plane, I am quite happy with mine. It's a record. I like it much more than the Stanleys. It's fun to have, but it doesn't get that much use, and I do a lot of work with curves. The other thing is it won't handle really, really tight curves very, very well. So I still end up falling back on spoke shaves, draw knives, axes, rasps, things like that, gouges even. It all depends. on the type of work you do. If you find you are building furniture and you're building that same curve over and over and over and over and over again, the compass plane can be very beneficial for you. But I think you could say the same thing with just about any tool, any specialized tool. If you build something that requires that specialized tool all the time, then yeah, it's much more than a nice to have. But if you're building a lot of different projects all the time, yeah, you know, there's very few tools that are absolutely essential. Jack plane, couple of chisels, couple of saws. That's it, folks. Those are the essential tools. Everything else is a nice to have, right? So yeah, I think a compass plane really falls on that nice to have spectrum. Just put it this way, I had a lot of tools before I ever man, my grammar's good today, or I even thought about getting a compass plane. So I want to talk real quickly, before I go too much further in the chat room, with this plane that does not have Stanley Bailey or Norris style adjuster. In fact, we've got this piece of poplar here. Let's just stick with it. So basically, how do we go about setting up the plane to begin a cut? And I'm sure that I've talked about this in videos before, but more than likely it was kind of wrapped up in another project. I'm going to specifically talk about this low angle plane. I'll do both. I'm not going to really go into wood planes here because that's a whole other conversation, maybe for a different topic. But you know, just because you're adjusting those with a mallet, obviously what we want to try to do here is mallet-free adjustments. Let's go with a standard, and whether this is bevel up or bevel down, this has a Bailey adjuster. So it's got the mechanism that advances the blade back and forth, but it also has a lateral adjuster. My Veritas planes have a Norris style adjuster where the advancement mechanism and the lateral adjuster is all built into one. On the Bailey mechanism, you have the separate lateral adjuster lever. That's really the major difference there. But the process that I go with is all entirely by eye. Again, I don't get very precious about the setup. I can remember when I first started hand planing, I was convinced that the blade had to be perfectly centered, perfectly parallel to the sole, and if I didn't do that, I would be struck by lightning and all of my projects would implode. These days, what I do is sight down the sole, and it's nice, one of the reasons that it's nice to have a light colored workbench, because it stands out a lot more. I set the blade forward substantially far. So it is really sticking out the bottom of the sole. I can very clearly see the blade. Then I will use the lateral adjuster to slide it back and forth and get it even by eye, entirely by eye. And that's one of the reasons that I've advanced it forward. It's probably a 1/16 of an inch proud of the sole at this point. And it's very easy to see if I'm high one side or another, or if I'm just basically even enough. Then what I'll do is actually back the whole thing out so that I'm getting no cut whatsoever. And now I will start to move it forward. Now what you can do, the more precise the plane, aka I'm using a smoothing plane with a 1/1000th of an inch shaving, or I'm using a jack plane and I'm taking an 8/1000th of an inch shaving, the more precise you want to be, the more precious you do need to be. And that's why in my apron pocket I always have this little block of maple that can be used to run down the blade. So what I'm doing, little block of maple, and I can slide it down one side, and is it catching? It's not, and it's not catching on that side. I'll advance it forward. I'm catching lightly on that side and catching lightly on that side. I mean, you hear that? But I'm also, I'm barely catching. I'm not even really making a shaving. I'm going to advance it a little bit more. And I can see it's not like it's sticking, same amount of pressure. It's not sticking one side or the other. That's even. And that is a very, very precise way to determine that this is even. For a jack plane like this, I would never do that, because I'm not going to be taking that light of a shaving with this guy. I'm going to be taking a heavier shaving, and there's really, if I tried with a heavier shaving to do this, I just advanced that a full rotation. There's no, I could maybe try to push this through with greater force, but it's going to stick. And here's the safety tip. Don't push this any harder because you're going to run the risk of cutting yourself. My finger is very close to that blade, and if you have to exert a lot of force to get that through, stop. That is the safety thing. So, you know, this is basically the setting that I would use on my jack plane. This is the thickness of cut I'll be using. There's no way this little block is going to help me at all. This little block only comes into bear when I'm dealing with a smoothing plane and trying to get that perfectly 1/1000th, half a thousandth of an inch cut. So at this point, I should be ready to take a pretty good cut. I'm going to even go forward more. So the question is, I'm not getting a full-length shaving at this point. Well, of course I'm not, because I'm dealing with a rough sawn board here that is not at all flat. I'm getting a shaving in the middle, a little shaving there, one there, and it's stuttering the rest of the way. The solution here is not to start advancing the blade because, oh, it's not cutting very well because it's too light of a cut. The minute you start advancing the blade is when you start getting the thing jamming and stopping on you because the board itself is not flat. It's only cutting in these few places because the topography of the board is preventing the blade from cutting all the way across. Now, in the instance of here, these are still pretty thin shavings. I'm going to advance it about a quarter of a turn just because who wants to spend all day working on this? And now, you know, I'm going to get more of a shaving, but over here in the area where I haven't planed yet, you see it's still stuttering on me because the board itself is not very flat. Let me give you a closer look here. So I'm skipping here, I'm skipping there, there, and there, but if I continue at this, continue working, you can see now I'm getting very close to a full-length shaving. A little bit of a stutter right down here in this low spot and on this wonderful knot. But there, I've now, for the most part, a little bit around that knot there, but for the most part, I've taken a shaving. You can see that is a beefy shaving. That's what a jack plane should be doing right there. Nice heavy shaving. I advanced it, what, 3-4 times in order to get to that point? But the key is, don't necessarily expect it to immediately take, you know, from this rough sawn surface to this in one pass. Maybe you could do that with a scrub plane or a 4-plane, but that's still a heck of a lot. Plus, if you're putting that heavy of a shaving, you could possibly be not flattening the board. Believe it or not, even though this plane wants to cut a flat board, when you take a super heavy shaving, the blade is hanging out so far that you could actually dish the board pretty easily. So you want to be cautious of going too heavy. Plus, if you just find yourself working so hard, what's the point, you know? So here, let's flip it and go to the other side. So the process again, just so that I'm, you know, reiterating this, the process again was advance the blade so that it's clearly proud of the surface, align it with a lateral adjuster by eye, back it off so it's not cutting, and then start to slowly advance it. If you're using a smoothing plane, again, it'd be the same thing. I will back it all the way out so that it's not cutting, slide it forward like a quarter turn of that adjuster, take a pass, another quarter turn, and still it starts to cut. And that quarter turn is usually enough for allow me to dial in that perfect whisper thin, basically translucent shaving. With the jack plane, that's not what I was going for, so I was taking massive adjustments. Half a turn, 3/4 of a turn, full turn, in order to get it cutting very, very quickly, because it's not about sneaking up on that perfect cut. But again, the process is still exactly the same. As I said, if you really want to get it perfectly aligned, use a little block. But here's the other little thing. My smoothing planes do not have a flat blade, right? They've got a camber. Now it's a very, very slight camber, but it is maybe 1,000, 2,000ths of an inch camber from one side to the other. So I can't align it in the blade because I'm dealing with a curve. What I want to do is just make sure that the corners are tucked up inside. So on this blade, what I will actually do is advance it so that I am getting a light cut. See, now I'm standing over my black floor and I can't see the blade. Okay. So now I'm just going to advance it till it was sticking out, and I'm going to back it out all the way. I got no resistance at all. I'm going to turn it like 1/8 of an inch or 1/8 of a rotation here, quarter rotation, whatever. And what I'm doing is using my little block right in the middle. Oop. Just like that, I went too far. Okay, so now it's grabbing in the middle. But because I've got a camber on this, if I go right to the edge, I've got no cut. I've got a little bit of a cut right there and no cut on that side. What does that tell me? I need to use a lateral adjuster to kind of budge it over just a little bit. That curve should have the corners tucked up inside. No cut there, no cut there, and a cut right down the middle. And that's how the smoothing plane should be set up. That curvature just tucks those corners back inside. And so it's not, the beauty is it's not about getting a perfectly parallel blade in that particular instance. Now, because that camber is so slight, you're almost perfectly parallel, right? But using that little block can really dial that in. The other thing, going to a greater extreme, my jack planes don't have a camber on them, but I've clipped the corners off. I doubt we can get this to show up. But think of these corners as like having a chamfer on them. There's a slight angle there where I've just taken it and literally, run it over the stone right on its edge and just clipped off that corner. So you've got a slight angle there. So rather than being a gentle curve that comes up in, what I'm doing is actually just tucking those corners back in and preventing those corners from digging in. Now it's a much more radical approach where here with this heavier shaving, see, I can't show this, but I can feel it. I can take this heavier shaving, and you see it's got very clearly defined edges, right? On a cambered smoothing plane, what you'll find is the edges of the shaving kind of taper away and they get really frayed because they're super, super thin. But there's a tiny bit of fraying on this end, but for the most part, they're well defined because this was a heavy shaving. But if I run my fingers to the middle, I can definitely feel that it's thicker in the middle and it tapers off to basically nothing at the edges. That is that slight clipping of the corners on my jack plane that's allowing that slightly easier passage of things. What that also means is I don't have to be quite so precious about getting it perfectly parallel inside the sole because I clipped those corners, and what it's more about is lining it up by eye so that those corners disappear down inside the sole. And every time I advance the blade forward, I want to make sure that I'm not exposing a corner. But if you've actually clipped off those corners at an angle, you've got to expose a hell of a lot of blade before the corners get exposed again. And even then, they're cut off at that little bit of an angle, so it's not quite that sharp corner that you might expect. Just a little thing there that I do on my jack plane. I haven't done it on my joiner plane because I do want to keep that square for jointing, for like creating panels and things like that. But on my jack planes, I do all of that. That's not true. I do have a joiner plane, but I have clipped the corners on a little bit. Because I find it's just easier to set up. And that's the same thing that I would do with this plane. Now, the problem I have here is there's no lateral adjuster. So what I'm going to do is, just like we did before, first thing I have to do is loosen this. This is too tight. So I'm going to pull this forward so again I can really see the blade. And you could very easily grab a plane mallet and you can tap it to line it up. But what I'm going to do is make my life a lot easier. This is locked in place. The cap iron is locked in place. But because all I'm trying to do is line this up by eye, what I'm going to do is loosen the cap iron by, I don't know, a quarter rotation. And what I want to be able to do is move the blade by hand. So I'm grabbing the blade down here, right at the end, and sighting down it, I'm just going to position it square. And then, this is not so loose that it's holding itself in friction, but now I'm just going to turn this back and tighten it up. And now it is laid out parallel by eye how I'd want to use it. And that's enough, frankly. Now you can up the ante a little bit by clipping those corners off, and it makes it even easier to align because all we're trying to do now is just ensure that we've got those corners tucked up inside the sole. I'll be honest and say I don't remember when I sharpened this blade last time. This is a plane that actually came from Ernie at Grandpa's Little Farm to kind of test out, and I haven't used it in a couple of weeks, so I don't really know where it is on its sharpness continuum. I am going to tighten up the mouth a little bit. This has got an adjustable throat. Allow me to tighten up the mouth just a bit because it's super wide open. So I don't think it's taken a very heavy cut at this point. No, almost no cut. So we'll advance it a little bit, need more than that. More than that. But I mean, I'm taking tiny, tiny thin shavings. This is not full of shavings because I've got this very fuzzy rough sawn surface here. I could keep planing like this and you'll see, you know, this rough sawn surface is going to start flattening itself out. But again, why am I trying to turn this, make it act like a smoothing plane? Because that's not what I'm trying to do at this point. But that now you can see is cutting like it should. Maybe another pass, and I'll remove all the little skip marks here. And there we go, close enough. Again, there's a low spot right there. But we're essentially setting it up the same way, doing it by eye. There's no reason to try to perfectly dial in a perfectly parallel blade because that's not really what we're wanting this plane to do. Now, that being said, the jack plane and the bevel up jack, because it is quite versatile, could be used as a smoothing plane. It will be a very precise smoothing plane because the sole is actually, you know, bigger, longer than your typical number 4 type smoothing plane. So you saw I could pull my cut back here and have it start taking more delicate shavings. But again, the board has to be flat enough to do that. And the board still needs some work here. But, I mean, you can just hear that. It's taking much, much thinner shavings than it was before. Nice little delicate guys, just by backing the blade off. Now here, let me zoom in on this because that was, some magic just happened there. As we reduce the depth of cut, we are requiring more precision of our blade. So while I was taking a big heavy cut, it was perfectly fine. The blade could have been aligned parallel on the sole or not. It didn't really matter. What again I'm wanting to do is flatten this out. Well, now I'm taking a lighter cut. And that's pretty good. Look at that shaving. And you can see it's a little bit, I mean, it's pretty wide, but it's a little bit skewed towards the left side of the blade. And it's not cutting too much over here on the right. So what does that tell me? It tells me that it isn't perfectly aligned, that there's a little bit more blade exposed on the left-hand side. And that is where, while the blade, and I will actually tighten this down even more, while the blade is tight, I can come in here and very lightly tap the high side and kind of pull it back in and see if that will do anything for me. This is also, by the way, why I always recommend clearing your shavings. You know, you can plane all day long and have the shavings pile up, but watching that where that shaving comes from will tell you a great deal. Now, in that instance, that's now coming out. You see that? Full width shaving. It's thin. I mean, you can see how it's almost translucent at this point, but it's centered in the blade, or centered in the sole rather. And this blade is now aligned. And you saw what I did. I mean, tiny little tap. the key is, if you're having trouble with this, tighten that down. Before you start tapping it, give it a turn to really lock this blade in place. So you would really have to wallop on this thing to adjust it. But a tiny little tap will be enough to bring it into line. But again, if you're wanting to use this jack plane like a smoothing plane, well then probably you want a slightly cambered iron, so that you're not getting any plane tracks. Because as I move to a finer and finer surface, those plane tracks will become more apparent, especially once you start putting finish on it. So in that instance, we relieve the corners, we camber the iron a little bit to get rid of those plane tracks. Well, now I'm kind of changing the role of this tool, and that's why if you're going to use a jack plane for kind of every task, it's a good idea to have a couple of blades, because now I can pop out my coarser work, my heavier jack plane blade that maybe has the corners clipped on it, and go to another blade that's got a slight camber on it. And now again, it's not really about aligning it. That process I just went through to get that shaving to come right out of the center of the mouth, as long as the corners are tucked out of the way, it doesn't matter. The shaving can be skewed to the left or the right. As long as the corners aren't interfacing and not leaving plane tracks, it doesn't matter. So again, that level of precision that we just went through by tapping this in order to center it perfectly is really not necessary, because if I were doing that level of precision planing, I would be using a cambered iron in the first place, just to eliminate the plane tracks. Yes, it is possible to eliminate plane tracks with a straight iron, but who wants to work that hard? I mean, that's silly. Why did our forefathers and ancestors use cambered irons in the first place? It's just so much easier to eliminate plane tracks. So yeah, the answer in this case is choosing the blade or choosing the tool for the job and not expecting that tool to do something that you don't really want it to. You don't need that level of precision when you're doing, from rough sawn to a flat board. If the blade is not perfectly aligned, it's not really that big of a deal. So cut yourself some slack a little bit, but that would be how I would go through it. Yes, it does require a little bit of a tap when you're dealing with that level of precision, but yeah, rarely am I going to get that precise. Okay, let's grab a couple more questions and then we got to call it a night. I have not made a Krinoff wood plane. I've been fortunate enough to have many Krinoff wood planes provided for me, and I have not needed to do it. They are fun to work with. Like Japanese saws, I'm more of a metal plane guy than a wood plane guy, except when it comes to my joiner planes, in which case that's the way to go. But yeah, it's just not something that I've done a lot of. Could you use part of a bandsaw blade for a Aruba frame saw? Possibly. My initial answer, my gut answer would be no, because those bandsaw blades, not only do they often tend to have a skip tooth, but they have a very aggressive rake. It is a positive rake on there so that it cuts and it grabs and it digs into the wood a lot faster. That positive rake angle, again, zero rake is straight up and down. Relaxing rake is pulling it in a negative way back from the toe. The toe's down here. Positive rake is leaning that tooth forward, and it will bite very aggressively into the wood. So most of your commercial bandsaw blades or bandsaw mill blades are going to have a positive rake angle on them, and it's going to be way too aggressive for what you want to do. It also can be fragile. The tooth itself can end up being fragile. And believe it or not, because we're not moving in a continuous high RPM motion, the reciprocal motion that is a lot slower RPMs is actually harder on those teeth than it is to be constantly in motion, because you've got momentum, right? P equals MV, constantly running, and there's less stress on those teeth because they're up to speed already. Well, I'm constantly stopping, reversing, starting, and reversing, and that aggressive rake on there will make it really hard to start, and you'll probably end up snapping teeth more than anything. So if you, now that will change obviously as you move down to a finer pitch. So if you're looking to truly make a bow saw or a frame saw, really a bow saw, and the Continuum, they're all called frame saws, right? They have a frame that's under tension. The really small ones are called fret saws. The slightly larger ones are called coping saws. Move up from that, you're into a turning saw. Move up from a turning saw, you're into a bow saw. You move from a bow saw into a frame saw. So in the continuum of sizes, frame saw will be the largest. Well, my resaw guys are truly frame saws. But if you want to move down to more of a bow saw, maybe a 24-inch blade or an 18-inch blade is pretty common. You can get away with a little bit more there because now you're dealing with a finer pitch, sometimes 12 points per inch, and that aggressive tooth is not, there's more of them, so you can get away with it more. If you're building a resaw frame saw like I have that's 5 points or 3 points per inch, you'll find that positive rake angle to be too much to overcome. You'll end up snapping teeth, you'll have real trouble getting the thing started, and you find yourself struggling to work with it a lot more. In the early days. In the early internet days, we're talking 2008, when people first started experimenting with these frame saw ideas. Adam Carabini went through this, Bob Rosieski went through this, the guys at the Anthony Hayes shop went through this for a while. We were using commercially available bandsaw blades, thinking, hey, there's a blade and the teeth are already cut, and that was the consensus was, no, this thing is a pain. I've actually used a frame saw with, it was 2 points per inch, so really aggressive, but I couldn't even get that sucker to start because that positive rake angle was kind of bad. The good news is the positive rake angle can be fixed. If the tooth is already leaning too far forward, you can file it back to straight, and that certainly is a lot easier than cutting brand new teeth. So if you can get your hands on a bandsaw blade like that, it is a possibility, but you're gonna have to adjust those, and maybe you go halfway. Maybe you bring that rake back to zero on half the teeth, and maybe that'll work for you. And maybe that little positive rake on every other tooth might make it more aggressive. That would be an experiment worth doing, but you're gonna have to do some filing there. I think you'll find that it's way too aggressive. Jeffrey, I don't have any experience with Zona saws. This was just sent in the mail today. This actually came from Sean Graham over at Worth the Effort. He sharpened this up. I'm gonna test it, but yeah, I don't have any Zona saw experience, sorry. Trouble making straight dowels with a dowel plate. Any suggestions on how to improve? Rive your stock. Best suggestion I can give you, don't try to make them too long. First of all, the longer they are, the more spindly and more they'll bend through things. But you want to, what's the expression? If I wanted to cut down a cherry tree and I had an hour to do it, I'd spend 50 minutes sharpening my axe. When you want to make straight pegs, what you want to be doing is spending the majority of your time preparing the stock to be driven through the peg. So this happens to be what I call my peg hook. It's a bench hook. It's got a cleat on the bottom. It's got a dog that actually references it on my bench so that the dowel plate falls over a hole. So the spacing of the holes on my bench mean that when I drop this dog into a hole, automatically I'm over another dog hole so I can drive it straight through. But there's more going on here, and this is the Veritas dowel former. I have a Lee Nielsen dowel plate as well. I also have a steel one that I made at the Stepping Stone Museum. But there's more going on here. This is where I'm driving the dowel through. This is the last stage. But before that, I've got this fence over here that I will actually use to rive out to start my stock. So if I've got, it'll be a little over time. This will be my last question, but let's just go ahead and make one. Do I have, I've got this little bucket here that I just put little offcuts and things into. Let's use this guy. So what I've got is my peg hook, and give me a dog hole, any dog hole, there it is. So again, that dog hole registers there. I don't need the vise in this instance, but it's here. Let's just go ahead and clamp it in. The cleat holds it up against the bench. Again, the dog just registers it, so now I'm sitting over top of a dog hole because my dogs are evenly spaced. You could also do that, just by eye. This is really fancy to have this dog hole there. But the first thing I'm going to do is start by riving out the stock. So this one has already been riven into somewhat of a block. I'm just going to use a chisel. And I'm not going to use my plane mallet for that. Let's use something a little bit more aggressive. So the first step is to rive my board. Ta-da! It's just that easy. Oh man, why does stuff always roll under the bench? I guarantee you that's not only under the bench, but all the way under the bench. Like the farthest possible it could be under the bench. All right. So I've taken that one board and I made two. So if I'm going to make, say, a 1/4-inch dowel, this is one of the reasons I like this Veritas dowel former, is just this fun, you swap them in and out like this. It's really cool. It's nice in a more permanent solution. It's a royal pain in the butt in like a toolbox, because you've got all these little parts to move around. In a toolbox, using a dowel plate is the way to go. And it's one of the reasons that I've never mounted this on a block, because it's usually, this goes out on the road with me, or if I'm doing green woodwork in the backyard, I take this with me. It's got all my sizes right there. But here in my shop, when I've got the luxury of a workbench and, you know, lighting and all that stuff, this is kind of my peg making solution. So this is where I'm going, right? Well, I'm still about where I want to be down there, but I've still got, you know, this wide section here. I've got a wide section there. The best thing you can do to make straighter pegs is to do a little bit more work. So this fence that I have down here, I can push up against the fence. I've got a wider section here. So what I'm going to do is use my chisel, and I'm going to narrow that out a little. This is rough work, but so I'm looking to get it into a somewhat square cross section. That's pretty close. And I dropped it on the floor again. So now, a little bit better shape. We had, you know, this really wide section. We're a little wide down here, so I'm going to turn it 90 degrees and go the other way. Now that's a little bit better. I'm essentially taking my kind of wonky shape and I'm making it more uniform. So I'm a little high in the middle. And there we go. So now, you know, yeah, it's still a little wonky, but for the most part, we are much closer to a consistent diameter on this thing than when we started. You know, this is kind of where we started. And I could technically come in here and, you know, point this. You can use a pencil sharpener for this as well. Or I could point this down to where it would actually fit in my dowel former. You know, I could point it down to the point where it'll actually get started in there. But now you're asking that to do a hell of a lot of work. And that's really, it doesn't jive very well. Over here, I've got another fence, and I've got little V-grooves set into this. If you really, really want like a dead straight peg for some reason, say you're actually making, say you're not making like a drawboard peg, but you're actually making like a visible dowel that you want it to be nice and round, I can drop these V-grooves in here, we'll cradle it, and now I can use a block plane to start shaping my piece. I've got a little angle there we go. I can now start planing it down and essentially making little octagons. And you can get very, very close just working with that fence. And I've got a slightly deeper V-groove over here to start shaping it down, rotate it, and go a little bit further. So again, step one was arriving at step two was just kind of roughing into shape. Step three could be maybe necessary to actually start creating a somewhat rounder piece, more of an octagon shape. But if I were making a drawbore peg, this would probably be enough. A little bit more. Even this thing is maybe a little too fat for the hole that I want to do. So in the interest of time, let's just go up a size. So now, because I've got a piece that's already somewhat well shaped, it's going to rise with a lot less effort. Now that I'm getting close to my fingers, let's switch to a wood mallet. And we're done. Except now I need to pop that out so that it comes out the bottom. I need another peg. That's the one thing. You need to always be making your pegs in pairs or have just one dowel stuck in there. But I could also pull this out and reach it over from the bottom. And now I've got a nice straight-ish peg. I mean, there's a little bit there, but again, if I'm making a drawbar peg, having it perfectly straight is not the goal. What my goal is to have continuous grain so that that will flex and bend without breaking as it goes around that offset. If I wanted to create an appearance grade peg, let's just call it that, an appearance grade peg, what we also call a dowel, that's when I would go through additional steps in order to begin shaping it. The dowel former is a very rough tool. It's hard on the wood. So if you want to shape it, if you wanted to do a finer job, you need to remove more material so you're not asking so much of the dowel plate or the dowel former. It means prep. So in order to create straighter, more beautiful pegs, you need to get much closer to the finished shape before you drive it through the former. But yeah, that's why I like that peg hook. Very nice, very beneficial. Cool. Well then, folks, I'm going to call it a night. I appreciate everybody for coming out. It's always a lot of fun. By the way, I say this every single week, but that peg hook, I mean, you guys pretty much saw it. There's no real secret to it, but that peg hook is one of the projects that I build for apprentices in the hand tool school. So it's one of many things in there, but that peg hook just happens to be one of the things that I built in the school. So, you know, if you're not interested in becoming a patron of this show, consider becoming a hand tool school student. Use that coupon, you get 10% off, and welcome to a whole new world. So thanks everybody for showing up, for hanging out, asking some good questions. We shall see you next week. Goodbye.